Hello and welcome to the Sprint 36 review. Can't believe that it's already Sprint number 36. Wow. Next slide, please. This was a standard 3-week sprint. So I'll go over the stats. Greg Blomquist will discuss the providers. Joe Rafaniello will talk about the Appliance Core. Tim will give us an update on the REST API. Dan will tell us about the UI. Greg McCullough will tell us about Automate, Brandon about Ansible, and Jason about some repo stuff that's new. Next slide, please. All right, so this was a pretty solid sprint. I think this is above average. 284 pull requests merged. I think in the next sprint or two, we'll start doing some sort of sprint-to-sprint statistics, so we have some sort of chart of how it's going, sprint over sprint. Not the next sprint and the sprint after. We'll try to pull that together and make that happen. So this one had 284 pull requests merged, 93 bugs, 65 enhancements, and the rest refactoring, and there was actually a big push on performance as well, although I only see 8 pull requests there, but I know there was a lot of work there. Maybe there's more ongoing. Next slide, please. So pull requests breakdown by feature category was 90 of them was in the UI, 69 was in the providers, and it's a pretty typical pattern, I think. And then everything else is sprinkled in. The green is the core, and the 21, I think that's I18N. Also, as usual, on the providers, about half were from the container team. That's a growing team there, so they continue to do to deliver, sprint after sprint. Also, there's Azure, which is in Azure color, and some Amazon work as well. But I think each provider there has representation, and that we're making progress on all fronts there. Next slide, please. The gymnasium, that's our dependencies, and shows the out-of-date Ruby gems, or not out-of-date, but ones where we're not using the latest Ruby gem. So we have 37 that are in need of review for potential upgrade. No red, meaning no security issues or anything like that. And we'll keep monitoring that from sprint to sprint. Next slide, please. We also do work on other repos besides the ManageIQ repo, and Jason will talk about the new one that was split out. But you see that there's a pretty good representation amongst a bunch of different repos there, with 3, 4s, and even a 6 on the Ansible side, which will is one of the reasons we have an Ansible demo today, not a demo of Prezo. So next slide, please. Okay, Greg B., over to you.
All right, so there's quite a bit to cover for Sprint 36. Here's a quick kind of preview of what I'm going to cover. There's some notable features from the containers integration team and a few OpenStack integration features. And I just want to hit on a couple of things going on behind the scenes. And finally, we're going to see 2 provisioning demos at the end. So next slide. All right, first off, the containers team, as Oleg pointed out, had another great turnout with 30 pull requests merged. The first highlight is making some of the containers related fields available to reporting. This kind of puts them on par with a lot of the other provider types where you can do reporting. Next slide. So another feature from the containers team links container registries with the services and pods that use those containers from those registries. This is just another great example of building that bigger picture for the administrator and striving to provide that best management story that we can. So thanks to the container integration team for all the hard work this sprint. Next slide. On the OpenStack side, We had a few background or back-end changes that will enable some UI work, some of which is already underway. First, we saw a feature that allows ManageIQ to tap into the OpenStack functionality of live VM migrations. And next was a feature that allows ManageIQ to resize an instance. This applies like a new flavor to the instance. And lastly, we've added support for Cinder and Glance v2 APIs, just trying to keep up with the evolving world of OpenStack. Next slide. So one of the things that's really hard to demo is just the kind of behind the scenes changes that enable larger features. There are two behind the scenes things going on in the provider space for Sprint 36. First, we've been working on cutting over from Amazon SDK v1 to their v2 SDK. Joe Vacek started this initial work, and our newcomer, Marcel Hild, took over. At this point, we have just a few places left to completely cut out the v1 SDK and be completely using v2. This actually also plays into the Gymnasium report that Oleg pointed out earlier. This is one of the things that we want to get up to date on. Secondly, is something that's been going kind of in the making for a really long time. Julian Cheel joined the team a few months ago, and we kind of immediately threw him into one of the hardest problems that we have, which is supporting multiple endpoints for providers. Previously, ManageIQ would only allow connections to one API endpoint for each provider. And for a long time, this was fine. But most providers have kind of segmented or separated their functionality into different APIs. So during Sprint 36, with a good deal of help from Jason Frey, Julian has finished the data modeling for multiple endpoints. And this is a big first step in supporting multiple endpoints. I should point out there's still a good bit of work left to do on this front, but I really wanted to call out this effort and what's been done so far. So next slide. All right, I'm going to hand over to Brona, and she's going to give a demo on Azure Provisioning.
All right. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
All right. Okay. So as Greg mentioned, I'm going to demo how to provision an Azure instance from a private user image. So right now we're looking at the instance view of an Azure provider. And we're going to launch the provisioning dialogues from Lifecycle menu. Here we're selecting a Linux image. We're going to enter in the required fields. Optionally set a tag. Select the number of instances and decide upon an instance name. We're going to manually place the instance. So we're going to select a cloud network, a subnet within that network, a security group, and a resource group, where a resource group is a logical container that groups together objects that share a deployment lifecycle in Azure, such as any assets required to run an application, for example. Select the flavor of the instance. Create a user account on the instance. And we're going to set our IP address and DNS information using DHCP. And I've created a cloud init script that will edit the resolve.com file on the instance and point to the Google name server. And I think we'll just set the default schedule. Now the request has entered the pending approvals phase, where we compare the request to any quotas or limits placed on the user or the user group. And you'll see from the green check mark that this request was approved. And now we're going to switch over to the Azure portal. And you'll see second row from the bottom, our instance is being created. And now it's running. And now we're going to verify that the Cloud Init script was executed correctly. So we're going to SSH into the instance and check the contents of the etcresolve.conf file. And it was set correctly. Now we'll switch to the ModernH UI, and we'll check to see if our new instance is displayed. And you'll see at the far right side it is. And this confirms that an AMS refresh was kicked off in the post-provisioning phase. And that's it. Next slide.
Thanks, Brona. That was really cool.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brona. That was awesome.
Great.
All right,
Hi.
and now, oh, sorry, Lars.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Okay,
No,
great.
you go ahead. I was going to say, just handing over to Lars to do the next
Oh,
provisioning
my bad.
demo.
Let me see. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Wonderful. I'm going to run through a quick GC provisioning demo starting off last week where you showed that the EMS refreshes were working. So right here you see I finished adding a fresh project as a cloud provider to ModernH. I skipped through the EMS refresh in a second, and I validate that by checking the existing flavors. As you can see, the machine types have been populated, so I start a provisioning workflow. I pick a Red Hat image. I enter the required fields. I'm going to provision a single instance, give it a name. I think it's instance demo 1, test instance 1. I pick a region to deploy to, a zone to deploy to. I only have one network configured, so I stay with that one. And I pick an inexpensive instance type and a small boot disk. And then I kick off the provisioning. I skip through the reload spamming, so I'm going to switch over to the compute page. And as you can see, after the refresh, the completed instance would show up right here with a boot disk associated. The machine type and the disk size match, so I go back here, and after a quick wait, I hit refresh. the instance shows up here, and as you can see, all the details are populated. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Lars.
Nope, no problem.
Thanks, Lars. Really appreciate it.
All right, next slide. I think we're over to Joe to talk about Appliance Core.
Yeah, so the Appliance Core area, there were several ongoing projects that we're working on, including replacing our Ruby replication. So we'll probably be starting to see some of the ongoing projects have actual reported demo or information. But in this sprint, we, in addition to that, we had some notable fixes and some new features. The first fix that's on here is we had an issue that was just not obvious to many developers, where loading the application controller was actually connecting to the database and running a query. So thanks to a fix provided on the containers team, we now don't have that, and people don't have that non-obvious situation occur. Primarily, it was a problem when we were trying to compile the assets where you don't necessarily need to have a database configured. So that was just not obvious to most people. So, additionally, some other members of other teams provided some performance improvements in some of the UI screens, most notably in the VM Explorer. Depending on the number of VMs you had, you could get a 10 to 20% performance improvement. Additionally, some of our primary seeding of the database was not actually letting us know when we were seeding improperly, so it was silently catching exceptions. So that was fixed, so now we should actually know when this occurs. In terms of new features, we started on trying to get a shopping cart model, so we should be seeing that in the UI, then follow-up sprints. In addition, we have a new role for chargeback and reporting. And then we have many enhancements to the REST API that Tim will be talking about. Next slide, please. Okay, Tim.
Okay. So we had many contributions this sprint, including a couple from outside the API team, which are always welcome. The first of which was from Roman Bertrand, who added 2 new actions to the provision request API to approve or deny a request. You can simply send a post with the provision request ID and the action name in the body, as in the examples here. Next slide, please. Okay, so we added a lot of actions to the instances API, so you can start, stop, pause, suspend, shelve, reset, or reboot instances. You can already do these in the VMs API, but since some of these only really apply to instances, it made sense to break out this instances API and as a separate endpoint. So we're trying to stay close to the structure and terminology from the UI. Next slide, please. So the syntax with all these actions is as per usual. You can use the ID in the URL and pass in the relevant action name in the request body, as in the first example here. Alternatively, you can do a bulk action by hitting API/instances with the action name and a list of resources, as in the second example here. The list can consist of IDs or hrefs. You can see hrefs being used here. Next slide, please. So ModernH added the ability to delete your authenticated token. This is needed in order to log out in the UI using the API backend. As you can see here, this is achieved simply by sending a delete to API/auth. Next slide, please. We also added the ability to optionally return authorization information when hitting the API entry point. We decided to add it in there so you can get everything you need after authenticating in just the one API call. In order to utilize this, you'll need to specify the authorization attribute in the request URL. You'll then see a list of product features that you're authorized for in the response. The product features are organized in a hierarchical structure, but we flatten them out in the response, so you just see a list of all the product features and their identifiers. You can also see the correlation to any API collection actions, as in the example there. And that's it. Over to Dan Clarizio, I think.
Thanks, Tim. All right, so in the user interface area, you can see the PR stats there, mostly bugs, but a lot of enhancements. I'm just going to call out some of the enhancements that were made. There's a lot of new styling stuff going on, new icons going in, new images, things like that. So you should be noticing that throughout the UI. On the new functionality side, though, we've got the I-18N, the internationalization support added into the SelfService UI. The support is there. There are no languages yet checked in, but I have some samples that we created. We also got the SelfService UI group switcher in, which basically comes to par with the operations UI, in that a user that belongs to multiple groups can now switch groups just like they did in the Ops UI. We added the UI support for Ansible Tower providers. I won't show those screens. Greg M will show the details behind that and have some screenshots as well for that after me. And then on the container side, a couple UI things were added there as well. They added persistent volumes and context menus to their topology charts or graphs. Next. So here's the self-service UI in French. All right, so there's like the main dashboard area, and if you hit the next button, next screen, we see an example of a service actually showing everything in French as well. So like I said, the support is there, but the languages aren't checked in yet. Those will be coming later as they get approved by the translators. Next. Here's the group switcher. You can see it's identical to the one in the operations UI. So there's a user signed in there and shows you which group you're currently in, and you can switch groups. And basically that resets your entire session. So any RBAC or filters or whatever are all applied once you change to the new group. Exactly the same as in the operations UI. Next slide. Here's the persistent volumes, new tab in the containers area. And not much else to say about that, but these guys are just moving forward here. Just keep adding more functionality. It's really great. Next slide. And in making the topology charts even more usable, they've added the context menu, so now you can do things like jump to summary pages, refresh the providers, various different things based on what type of item you're looking at there in the topology. And that's it on the UI side. So next.
All right. So from the automate side, the retirement workflow for infrastructure did not include everything you needed for SCVMM. So in this sprint, we got the changes merged in to fully support that workflow. And then from the modeling side, there's an instance of .missing that you can use to capture when a method or an instance is not defined in a class. So previously, you would use that and maybe call something default, but we realized that being able to retain the method that you actually were initially calling was quite useful, and so it's accessible through resolution and then within methods. And the real use case behind this is, and the screenshots are here to show it, is that a lot of times you create instances within Automate only to call the same exact method. So you have a lot of duplication of instance name, method name, wiring it up. So this can be reduced down to having a simple .missing method in place that calls through with the name that you initially called the instance for. The only requirement here is obviously that the instance name and the method name match, but a number of people that have implemented stuff in Automate have come back and said, why do I have to have an instance available for every method when it's not doing anything more than calling straight through? So this enhancement allows you to reduce the number of instances that you would have to create on any class, and should be quite useful. That's really it from the Automate side. Next is Ansible, and Brandon's going to tell us what's going on there.
Hold on, there was a question on that one. Kevin Moore is asking if it's case sensitive or not.
It is not.
Okay. So there were a bunch of both UI changes and backend changes for Ansible this sprint. For the backend, we added the refresh of configuration scripts, which are Ansible job templates. We're planning to expose these for use in Automate. We had to make some enhancements to the Ansible Tower Client gem as well. We're adding host groups and inventory ID so that we can create the relationship tree between the inventory and the groups, both for display in UI and also for Automate usage when you're running a configuration script so that you can select what to apply it to. Also added some passing of extra vars to a job template launch, and that modeling is happening now in the ManageIQ product. And we also added some validation for the variables that you pass into the extra vars. So next slide, please. Laura did a bunch of UI work around Ansible, made it very similar to the Foreman provider. So now you can add an Ansible Tower provider through the UI, giving it a name, a URL, and credentials. And the only real difference between Foreman and the UI that we had and what we have now is that you have a type dropdown, so you can select Ansible Tower or Foreman. Next slide. Once your provider is added and refreshed, you can go to the Configuration Managers page and see the Configuration Manager that you just added. Has some basic details there. Next slide. And then we have the list of configured systems that are attached to that provider. Next slide.
All right. Thanks, Greg and Brandon. Over to Jason.
All right. So in this sprint, we extracted the SelfService UI into its own repo. Previously, it was in the SPA UI self-service directory. We took that entire directory and all the Git history and moved it into the ManageIQ UI self-service repo. Because it's a single-page application, it can live on its own. So it made sense to kind of separate it out, allow it to have its own lifecycle, and issues, tracking, and all that other good stuff. Another good part about moving it out is that the tests no longer run with ManageIQ. So previously, any pull request that was made would run those tests. And the problem there is that it uses Node.js, and dependency resolution is not that great with Node.js, in my opinion. So it would fail every so often. So you'd make a change in Ruby code, and suddenly self-service code would fail, and your PR would be a failure. It didn't make any sense. So now that it's in its separate repo, it runs only when we make changes to the self-service UI. And additionally, we can use Travis caching to save the node modules and the Bower components between runs. So instead of having to install the world, it just kind of does an update when it needs to. So the tests only take a minute over there as opposed to 5 minutes in the ManageIQ repo. And one of the cool thing about this is we got the pattern set up for possibly other independent UIs in their own repos. We've got it part of the build process. It was working on nightlies. So hopefully this will let us move forward with creating new UIs. And that's it for me.
Okay. Next slide. All right, so that brings us to the end of the sprint demo. One thing that I wanted to mention is that after, so this sprint, the code for the sprint ended Monday night. Tuesday morning, we merged a pull request to upgrade to Rails 5. So the current nightlies are less stable, I would say, than what we had on Monday. Hoping it'll be stabilized over the next number of days, or certainly by the next sprint demo. You know, so use the builds from Monday. They probably are a little bit more stable. If you want to use the product for developers, I would say still stay in the nightlies because you're making pull requests against those. And so that's it. Great sprint demo, I think. You know, with major highlights from several providers, Google, Azure, Ansible. Those are certainly the highlights in my opinion, but I think really everybody did a great job in producing a really great sprint. So with that, I just want to say thank you and turn it over to questions. That was quiet. All right, Kevin says nice work, everyone. I agree. Thanks a lot, everyone, and let's call it a wrap then. We'll see you all in 3 weeks.
Cool.